Today we're going to be covering Unit 2, Day 1, as we jump into 1607 and the beginning of the English colonization of North America here. Again, Unit 2, if you look at the dates on it, 1607 to 1754. 1607, of course, being the founding of Jamestown, in 1754, which marked the beginning of the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, which we will talk about in the next unit. So, start today, you're going to read an article about what is Atlantic history and realize how North American history really plays a bigger part in world history and overall Atlantic history, which Atlantic history really focuses on the interactions between North, South America, Africa, and Europe all together across the Atlantic Ocean. So, what is Atlantic history? This is, if you're looking up for a word-by-word definition here, the commercial, religious, philosophical, and political interactions among Europeans, Africans, and natives, stimulated economic growth, expanded social networks, and reshaped labor systems. So like I said before, the Columbian Exchange, which we've already talked about, all of that reflects Atlantic history. Again, you're looking at how all these four areas are coming together and interacting in different ways. So you have the Columbian Exchange, you have the promotion of Anglicanization in the British colonies, which basically is Europeanizing North America. And you see that politically, religiously, in a lot of different ways, and also ideas with race. You have slavery come over. Again, slavery in North America and South America defined by African slavery. Racial stereotyping. We talked about how natives were seen often as savages. You have that stereotyping. And also racial categories. When we talked about the Spanish and you saw the mulattoes and the mestizos and how they were categorized into those certain things. So again, these four areas are going to be interacting in a lot of different ways during this time. And it's interesting because in history, again, this is going to be this first time that you're going to see these four interact in such a way. So remember, review, we talked about this at the end of the last unit. The Spanish, they wanted tight control over the process of colonization in the West, and they wanted to convert Indians. Their focus, too, was on making settlements here. The French and the Dutch, they involved very few Europeans, used trade alliances and intermarriage with Indians to acquire furs and other products for export to Europe. So we talked about the French and the Dutch, how really a lot of what they were here to do was to make money. The French were different than the Dutch. Then the French also focused on conversion, whereas the Dutch did not really focus on that very much. So English colonization. So starting in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, you would have the first permanent English colony. And then that would end with Georgia in 1733. And you would have a total of 13 English colonies that would be developed along the Atlantic coast. You're going to see that each colony had one of three types of charters: a corporate charter, which meant that it was owned by a joint stock company, such as that's how Jamestown got started; a royal charter, which meant that it was under direct authority and rule of the colonies. The king had control over them. Virginia would become that after 1624. That corporate charter would become a royal one. And then you'd have a proprietary one, which meant that you were under the authority of individual grants chartered by the king. So areas such as Maryland and Pennsylvania would be under there. Maryland started, again, as a Catholic haven. Pennsylvania started as a kind of a haven for Quakers, but also a place of religious freedom. So unlike the French and the Spanish, who kind of came up with their own forms of governments when they created their colonies, you're going to see that the English, they brought their tradition of representative government here. Now, again, that would look different based on which area of the English colonies you went into, but all of them had the same general feel to them, this representative government. So what was the English goals? Again, their goals here was to establish permanent colonies based on agriculture. At the beginning, you'll see Jamestown didn't send a lot of women here. It was mostly men, but very quickly, they started sending men, women, and children here to acquire land and be able to populate these settlements. The English, the relationship with the natives, again, varied based on where you were. But generally, it was relatively hostile. And you're going to see that the primary two locations settled by the English would be the New England colonies and then the Chesapeake region, which would be Virginia and Maryland. AP tends to talk about and compare New England and Chesapeake quite often, which you probably aren't as familiar with the Chesapeake term when referring to the colonies. Generally, most people are more familiar with referring to just the southern colonies as a whole, but at the beginning here, really the focus was on the Chesapeake region. Now, with the English, of course, they had founded colonies earlier on before Jamestown, such as the Roanoke Island colony, but none of those colonies had been successful, with the Roanoke Island colony, of course, famously disappearing, and they believe that those colonists ended up being taken in by native tribes in the area there, but Jamestown would be that first permanent one. So Chesapeake colonies, again, they are made up of the colonies from Virginia and Maryland. They're called so because they're along the Chesapeake Bay. Virginia and Maryland had very, very similar colonies based on tobacco. They would also practice slavery once that got established here later on. Both of those colonies would be similar in that way. In fact, these two colonies were so similar. When we get to the Civil War, you're going to see Virginia and Maryland were still very, very similar, the two sides were. And that's why you're going to see Maryland, who has a lot of pro-Confederate sympathies when we talk about the Civil War. As far as the Chesapeake colonies, again, these were created to be populous colonies aimed to eventually take the Indian lands away from them. And King James I would grant merchants from London a monopoly from North Carolina to New York, and the whole area would be named Virginia. So when you're looking at this map here, the colony of Virginia, you're going to see that at the beginning, Virginia really extended a large, large area there. And you can see out into Michigan, Wisconsin, all of that area was considered part of Virginia. So at one time, what would eventually become the state of Virginia would occupy a massive amount of territory here in the New World. Now, Jamestown. Jamestown was created by the Virginia Company of London for trade. You're going to see at the beginning, death rates would be very, very high there, and there was very, very little food. And part of that is due to the hostility with the Powhatan Indians in this area. And in fact, Jamestown would have been another failed attempt at an English colony if it had not been for John Rolfe introducing tobacco farming into Virginia. Virginia's soil climate is perfect for tobacco growth. And once that gets introduced here and they realize they can make money off of it versus trying to find gold, which had kind of been a myth here in Virginia for a long time, once they find the tobacco and this cash crop, they can make a lot of money off of that here. In 1619, you would see the Virginia colonists would organize the House of Burgesses, which would be the first representative assembly here in America. And then by 1624, as I've already told you, Virginia would become a royal colony because of a lot of mismanagement here, because of some Indian rebellions that you would have here as well. Eventually, Virginia would get turned over and be under direct control of the crown. Now, when we talk about Jamestown, it's important to realize, again, things at Jamestown were not easy. Jamestown went through a starving time where they believe that some of the colonists actually engaged in cannibalism, eating dead bodies, and basically eating everything that they could. Jamestown, at one point, everybody in the colony loaded up on a ship to actually leave and head back to England because they were sick of this. And as they were sailing down the Chesapeake Bay, the James River out into the Chesapeake Bay, a ship showed up, a resupply ship, and saved Jamestown. But Jamestown was very much on the verge of failing. Economics in the Chesapeake. So you're going to see that tobacco, again, created this economic boom. And through the efforts of John Rolfe, he is able to introduce a new variety of tobacco. And again, this is going to attract more and more people. Once there is a set way here in the colonies to make money, this is going to attract people to come here because now they can farm and they can make money. Now, tobacco is a very, very labor-intensive product. I know this personally. My family farmed tobacco for many, many generations, and my grandpa was actually the last generation to do that. But I grew up working in tobacco, and I know that it is very, very hard work. So it's a labor-intensive product. And at first, tobacco was worked here by indentured servants, and then that would be worked by, of course, African slaves. You'd have 15,000 English arrive from 1622 to 1640, but you're going to see the population doesn't rise very much. And again, you're going to have a lot of men that are going to come here, but the other issue is because of the rough conditions here, you're going to have a lot of people die as a result of living in the colonies here. So that's the economics of the Chesapeake. I know we focus a lot on Virginia, but you're going to see similarities territories there with Maryland as well. So because of labor shortages, you're going to see that leads to a search for workers. Now, initially, the work was done by indentured servants. Basically, what an indentured servant did is it was somebody that either they would come here and work off a debt to somebody, or it was someone who wanted passage to the New World. They couldn't afford it themselves, so they would go into debt somebody and agree, hey, I'll work for you. Usually the period of work was about 7 years. Once you got to the end of that period, you would be able to earn your freedom. Now, because of that not working and them not being able to get enough workers through that, Virginia attempted to try to use the headright system, which meant that they would offer land to each immigrant that paid for their own passage, or for any plantation owner that paid for immigrants' passage. So basically, they're trying to attract people by giving them land. And again, that would not be enough. So in 1619, you would have English privateers, which basically what a privateer was a legal pirate. They were a pirate that was sanctioned by a country in Europe. They would bring 20 to 30 enslaved Africans to Point Comfort, Virginia. These had been privateered from a Portuguese ship. They would be brought here. Now, historians aren't sure if these Africans were all used as slaves. They believe that some of them had would actually be treated as indentured servants. They believe that some of them may have been given their actual freedom here. So we aren't totally sure, but we do mark this as the beginning of slavery in the United States, or in what would become the United States. Like I said, even though they were not necessarily slaves, you're going to see by the later 17th century, Virginia laws made their offspring slaves. So even though they might not have been slaves, their children down the road would be forced to become slaves. So Maryland, 1632, Maryland would be created by King Charles as a second tobacco colony and as a refuge for Catholics. Control was given to Lord Baltimore. If you ever wondered where the name Baltimore comes from, that is where, because of his service to that. And you're going to see within Maryland, even though that it was created as a Catholic colony, that Protestants would quickly outnumber the Catholics in Maryland. So as a result of that, Maryland would pass the Act of Toleration in 1649, which granted religious freedom to all Christians in the Maryland colonies. So this would be a first statute of its kind in the colonies, and the first time that you would see these talks of religious freedom within the new colonies. Now, again, this religious freedom was given to Christians, no other groups, but you didn't really have many other religious groups here at the time. But it was an early first step in an attempt, and you can kind of say that this almost paves the way for over 100 years later when Jefferson here in Virginia would create the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. So what are the economic characteristics of the southern colonies? The external lowlands, eastern coastal lowlands, would be based on large plantations, which grew cash crops. We've already talked about Virginia and Maryland and tobacco. In North Carolina, you would have rice. Farther south, when those get established, you'd also have indigo as well. You will see this contrast between the coastal lowlands and the mountains. In the mountains and the valleys of the Appalachian, there you tended to have more small-scale subsistence farming, which meant you were farming to provide for the needs of your family. You would have more hunting and trading with native groups and between settlers there. So there you did not see the extensive and the very large plantations like you saw on the coast. If you ever have a chance today to drive through Virginia, I encourage you, if you take 460 and go down and then take some of the back roads to go over to like Williamsburg, and in that you'll get to see a lot of these old plantations, and you can kind of tell the difference between that area and the area that we live in today. Again, that difference is still here today. So in the British Islands, in the West Indies, you're going to see that slaves would be started to be used there and to help develop economies based on staple crops such as sugar. Sugar plantations would be absolutely massive in Barbados and other areas in the West Indies down there. And we'll talk about the difference in slavery between these two places as well. Social characteristics, you're going to see that in the South, that family status and the ownership of land was very, very important. Usually with that ownership of land became the ownership of slaves as well. So the amount of land and slaves that you owned said a lot about your family status and how influential you were within society. Because of that, the large landowners in the East would dominate colonial government and society. you would see that they would often maintain an allegiance to the Church of England and have very close social ties with England. And this is something that would continue even after our nation is created, after the Revolutionary War. You're going to see that the South really does maintain a lot of those ties with England, and that would continue again for quite a while. In the mountains, you're going to have a lot of Scots-Irish and people of English descent, but a lot of Scots-Irish would come into the mountains of Virginia and even Pennsylvania and those areas as well. And like I already said, you're going to see, because of that allegiance to the Church of England, the Anglican Church dominated in Virginia. Political lives, like I said, the landowners played a leading role in the representation of colonial legislatures here, and they would have the most influence as far as politics would go in the southern colonies. As far as the Carolinas would go, you would see the Carolinas would be settled as early as the late 1660s. And by 1669, you would have the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, which created a manorial system with nobility and serfs controlled by powerful nobles. Basically, it avoided there being a democracy in the Carolinas. And this should sound familiar because this is exactly what had been happening over in England for hundreds of years. The lower class, though, would not respond very favorably to this, and eventually these fundamental constitutions of Carolina would go out to pasture because people didn't like this whole system of doing things. They didn't want to return to the old system of England. They liked the idea of having a representative government, which at this point England had. All right, South Carolina. Again, South Carolina, their early economy was based on trading furs and food, and eventually that changed to rice growing and having plantations worked by slaves dominated in the South Carolina regions. You'll see conflicts with natives were very, very common there and threatened the existence of the early colonies. Charlestown, which eventually becomes Charleston, would be a big hub for the economy of South Carolina, as it would be a big trade port later on. North Carolina, again, North Carolina, you're seeing North Carolina very similar to Virginia in that they established small farms there. North Carolina did have some good harbors, but had very poor transportation. So you're going to see there that, again, it didn't go the way of large plantations like South Carolina did, that it had a lot of smaller farms, smaller self-sufficient tobacco farms. So there was less reliance on slavery within North Carolina. And you will see that by the 18th century, North Carolina would get a reputation for being a very democratic state or colony and having a lot of autonomy from the British control there. And again, when we talk about few good harbors, if you've ever been to like the Outer Banks, you're going to know that kind of creates a sandbar there, which means that North Carolina doesn't really have any of those big harbors, such as a Charlestown or a Norfolk or that kind of place. They just don't have the geography for that kind of thing. All right. The last thing that you're going to be doing here is looking at some primary sources from the 1993 DBQ. With that, you're going to look at and analyze these documents and then create a thesis statement based on that. And it's important to look at and be familiar with those, as you will be writing a DBQ, which will be due test day of this unit about these documents and about this question here. So I encourage you, spend your time going through those and looking at these. And remember, a thesis statement should be a one-sentence statement, and it is usually at the end of your first, your introductory paragraph. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you have a great day.